September 17th, 1987. We were told to go look at a concrete problem. They handed us drawings, a one-line brief, and a name on a routing slip, Dulce. 5 words on a folder, and a colonel who kept his hands clasped behind his back like he was holding something he wouldn't let go of. I thought it would be routine. I thought we'd be in and out, sign a form, take a picture of cracked rebar, and go home. I was Sergeant Ethan Ramirez. I ran a 4-man team out of Kirtland AFB. Miguel Torres handled comms and logistics. Javier Luna was our lead on security. David Ortega drove. We were not the intelligence guys, not biocontainment specialists, not any kind of research muscle. We were structural assessment, perimeter security, basic technical reconnaissance, people who made sure things weren't collapsing on anyone. That day, that kind of ordinariness lasted about as long as the briefing. Colonel Marcus Hayes was short with paperwork and longer with rules. He read them out like laws the way some men read prayers, slow and absolute. No pictures without approval, no samples outside chain of custody, no contact with specimens. He used the phrase unknown origin once, like a warning tossed into the air to set the room's temperature. There was little else, no broad context, no friendly explanation. That absence sat heavy on all of us. Military people live by orders, but the lack of detail was its own kind of order. We took it because that's what you do. You take instructions and you make them into procedures. We loaded up at dawn. The sky above Albuquerque was clear, desert blue, sun like a coin against a horizon that promised heat. We drove out with a small convoy, the truck bed rattling with equipment crates, the radio full of static and other check-ins. Miguel kept the manifest in a tight plastic sleeve, badges, passes that gave us access to a facility on a map none of us had ever seen. The road to Dulce is dirt and distance. Barbed wire ran along some ridge lines, but nothing looked like the kind of place that hides things worth keeping secret. There were ranches out on either side, goats and the slow drift of tumbleweed. The oddness was in the contrast, small town surface, heavy protocol underneath. The site itself sat behind a chain-link fence, a slope cut into the earth, a concrete mouth that swallowed the road. Security on the perimeter was tight, but not theatrical. Guard booths, motion sensors that blinked in pale rectilinear patterns, a sign that might as well have read "No Trespass" in any language. The escort, uniformed personnel from the on-site command, moved us through metal detectors and into a decontamination anteroom. We were told to change into coveralls. The air smelled of industrial cleaners and something metallic that wasn't quite blood and wasn't quite new metal. It clung to the back of my throat.
The environmental monitors mounted on the wall hummed quietly. Green LED readouts like watchful eyes. Miguel checked them for me, fingers precise and habitual. The monitors cycled. Green, yellow, back to green. They were the kind of small, confident devices that you notice more when they show you something out of sequence. We rode down in an elevator that felt like a throat. Lights tracked the descent in a banded pattern. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in the span of 60 yards, and the moisture in the air condensed against the stainless walls, painting faint rivulets that caught the emergency lighting and refracted it into thin strips of red. The red washed the faces in the elevator like a filter, making everything look like an alarm. Level 2 opened into something that, at first glance, made sense. Administrative modules, offices with laminated signs, a whiteboard with dates and tasks, a water cooler. It was almost domestic in its ordinariness, which made it worse. The sense that misdirection is used to disguise what matters is an old one when you do what we did for a living. People try to bury what they're ashamed of under a layer of the familiar. We moved in a tight file. Javier scanned doors with a practiced, economical glance. David kept his hands near the truck keys, unconscious probably, more habit than plan. Miguel played with the comms, running check-ins, sending out one-line status updates. We followed a research coordinator, a short man in a navy jacket, who led us past a row of cubbyholes filled with files. He talked fast and clipped. "Routine checks," he said. "Structural integrity and HVAC recalibration. We've been having anomalies with the environmental arrays." The environmental arrays. Another phrase that sounded like paperwork until you see the monitors blink yellow. Level 3 felt different before we saw anything to prove it. The corridor narrowed. The lights were closer together, the hum of machinery above became a constant, and the air took on a cool, damp scent that suggested enclosed spaces and condensation. We found an unmapped door in a place where the schematics promised bare concrete. It had no number, no painted label, no log entry we could find. It sat recessed, as if it had been added later and tried not to be noticed. Miguel ran his hand along the wall, then traced the seam of the door. There was a keyed lock and a personnel scanner that didn't emit the usual chirp when it was checked. It was there, but it wasn't on the book. You develop a sixth sense in those moments. Sometimes it's called professional paranoia. Sometimes it's just the feel of a place telling you that it doesn't match its paperwork. We called it in. The short coat coordinator, who I later learned was Dr. Samuel Moreno, smiled as if we'd discovered a surprise. Dr. Moreno wore a lab-issue sweater under his jacket and had a nervous way of tapping his notepad against his thigh. He told us the door should not have been on the map. He said it in a way that meant he knew why and that someone else had told him not to tell us. He used the phrase restricted access, as if that labeled everything clean and tidy. Behind that door was an area that did not belong to administrative convenience. Reinforced glass windows lined the corridor like portholes. Behind some of the glass were cells, spaces small as hospital rooms, each one immaculate and smelling of sterilizer. They looked empty, but clean in the way you clean a place to hide a presence. Some of the doors were sealed with bars bolted through, heavy steel that locked into the concrete floor. The observation panels were intact, but several had scuffs, like something had pressed against them and then been moved away. The air vents hummed with a hushed intensity, drawing air from the rooms and returning it in a loop. There were drains in the center of the floors that looked like they had been scrubbed recently. Something about the arrangement suggested containment rather than storage. Equipment racks with devices we didn't recognize lined a side room. A refrigerator, sealed and labeled with a code, held boxes of vials. Labels had been blacked out with a marker. On a lab bench, a small tray displayed sample containers, neat and clinical. No one volunteered more than the practiced, precise phrases, standard containment protocol, protective environment, biosequestration. Those words are useful when you want to say much and mean little. Dr. Alan Cortez arrived after us. He was taller than Moreno and wore oversight in his posture. He walked the glass corridor slow, hands clasped behind him like someone keeping his balance against a memory. He said very little, but when he did, his voice carried that way older men carry a history, less like fact and more like implication. He referred once, almost offhand, to previous incidents, using a single syllable and then changing the subject. It was enough to make us all stop trying to make the pieces fit. The environmental monitors flicked at odd intervals. A strip of green would go to yellow for a few seconds and then slip back, like a warning somebody had silenced. Miguel tapped on one and squinted. He told me later that he thought he saw a faint deviation in the particulate counts. Nothing conclusive, nothing that would stand up in a lab, but his training makes him look at those micro signals. When the monitors go yellow, for anyone who has ever stood in a place designed to keep things in, the world suddenly feels larger than your instructions allow. We moved into a space that had the feel of a lab prepared for things the textbooks don't have an index for. Benchtops with microscopes that didn't look standard, a glass cabinet with tools that were worn not from use but from careful handling, like instruments handled only with gloves and with purpose. There were notes on clipboards. Most pages were redacted. One sheet, not redacted, had a terse observation. Subjects exhibit non-human morphology. Further analysis recommended. The phrase sat on the page like a stone. I remember the way the sound of that echo within us, people who take orders and hand back reports, settled like dust. We weren't supposed to ask the big questions. Colonel Hayes had made that clear. But curiosity doesn't obey orders any more than a storm does. I remember standing at one of the observation windows, looking into a cell that had been made like a small utilitarian room. It had a cot, a few restraints bolted to the floor, and a light that could be dimmed. Nothing about that room made sense for the kind of research facility the file had implied. It looked like a space for watching. Someone had written something on the glass with a grease pencil, "Not for public view." The letters looked like they had been written by someone who wrote them often, by people who belonged to the secret of the facility. We were told to keep our faces neutral, our hands visible, our radios low. That's how you behave in a room of such rules. You let the silence do the talking. It was Miguel who broke it first, low enough that only we could hear him. "Why would they build cells like that?" he said. The question was small, but the answer is the part nobody can hand you in a neat folder. There was a shift in the mood when Dr. Moreno ushered us toward a rear access elevator. He said something about a sealed level below, level 5. His voice was smaller there, like somebody lowering a curtain. He told us they wanted a security sweep. Colonel Hayes, when informed, agreed without surprise. He had the look of a man who carries possession of decisions he would rather not have made and would rather not explain. The descent to level 5 was the thing that could have been a movie in its pacing. The elevator handled us differently, with a grinding sound that was less an artifact and more a protest. The cable's hum altered. The light slats in the shaft cast the walls in staccato shadows. The air grew colder. There was a depth that even numbers can't properly convey when you're under a place the rest of the world calls flat desert. We passed a marker that read Level 4, and the doors closed with a thick hydraulic sigh. On the way down, the comms in my helmet picked up a faint transmission. It was a voice muffled by echo and distance. I couldn't make out the words initially, just cadence and a worry behind it. Javier tightened his jaw. David leaned forward. Miguel checked the manifest again as if it might rearrange itself into reason. A light on the panel outside the elevator blinked yellow once and then returned to a solid, unnatural blue, a color I wouldn't see again without remembering the smell of that place. Level 5 is sealed. That phrase has weight. In training, sealed means no casual entry. It means a threshold that once crossed does not let you simply walk back out carrying the previous version of yourself. The corridor that opened up had heavy plating and a perimeter of panels with biometric locks. Cables ran like veins along the ceiling, wrapped and insulated. The air tasted thin. A control room sat to the side, windows banked with multiple monitors showing feeds. Some corridors, a bank of tanks large as coffins, and a room that looked like an operating theater with bright light and empty instruments. We were escorted into the control room. A man sat at a console like a watchman keeps a lighthouse. His eyes flicked over us with the efficiency of someone who has learned the shape of fear. Dr. Cortez moved closer to the monitor bank, and the picture changed to a long view of the tank banks. I knew from the angle that the tanks were on the other side of thick, reinforced panes. The room hummed with the sound of refrigeration systems and something else, an electric buzz that seemed to vibrate the fillings in my teeth. When the monitor switched to an up-close view, I saw them. At first, they were silhouettes against stainless steel through the glass. Cylindrical tanks lined in a row, each one standing like a grave. The tanks had the soft distortion of thick glass. Inside the nearest one, a body hung suspended in a fluid that made everything look soft and wrong. It was humanoid in length and proportion, and then not. Limbs too slender, joints that bent at angles the human skeleton does not, fingers longer than should be possible. The head was large in proportion, the face flattened with an expanse where you would expect cheekbones. The eyes, when the tank's internal floodlight grazed that face, were dark and enormous, taking up more of the face than a human eye should. They were not inhuman because they failed to resemble anything we knew. They were inhuman because they seemed to carry intent in the way they held light. Subject retention, Dr. Moreno said, quieter than before. Unknown origin. He said it without the flourish of a headline. The phrase slid out like the result of a lab test, limited, provisional, a description of a moment. We were told not to draw conclusions, yet my brain, the same one that had been trained to check for stress fractures and weld fatigue, translated morphology into meaning. The glass separated us. The tanks were steel and glass and circuitry, and inside their confines was something alive enough, or was alive once enough to make me feel small and defensive in a way that had nothing to do with our guns. One of the tanks was labeled in a neat serif, Tank 7. It sat slightly ajar, its seals not fully engaged. The liquid sloshed with a delicate, eerie ripple. Where the others were composed and still, the subject in 7 shifted. It was subtle, a contraction and release, like a fish pushing against an ocean. The observation camera panned to it. For a moment, the lens caught a movement, a hand too long, too delicate, pressing to the interior in what could have been curiosity or panic. The glass fogged, and the light inside the tank refracted in odd prisms. Dr. Cortez's face tightened. He said one sentence I can still hear clearly. We need a transfer. He didn't say it as an order to us. He said it as a problem he needed to move out of the room, a complication that required more hands and more control. His shoulders were compressed, like someone holding a secret box. He used the word transfer in a way that made it sound as if it were a known procedure, with checklists and steps and contingencies, none of which we fully knew. I felt something else at the edge of that moment. The subject inside Tank 7 turned its head, or rather its head shifted to an angle that registered what I would later call attention. Its eyes opened and seemed to meet the window, and from where I stood, the gaze didn't feel like an animal's. It felt like recognition. For a second, suffused with fluorescent light and the cold taste of steel air, I had the uncanny impression that whatever was looking back was not simply reacting, but choosing to look. Recognition is a heavy thing when you're the kind of person trained to look and not be looked at. Javier tightened his grip on the edge of the console, and I watched the skin around his knuckles whiten. Miguel's hand hovered over his radio, but didn't push the button. David's jaw worked. The room held the sound of breath. Dr. Moreno spoke then, and his voice carried a mixture of the professional and the personal. We keep them in tanks to monitor osmotic balance, to preserve tissues for analysis. We isolate to minimize cross-contamination. He used phrases that could be mistaken for concern and defense all at once. He didn't look at us when he said it. He looked at the subject in 7. There was something in his face that told me he had been awake nights thinking in the language of containment and ethics, and that his sleep had been naked to the same question. What are we holding, and what right do we have to hold it? Someone on the comm line cleared their throat, a flat sound that the speakers translated through a half-second lag. Colonel Hayes's voice, when it arrived, was composed of the clipped syllables of command. Secure the asset. No transfers outside established protocol until further notice. It sounded like a lid being closed. Dr. Cortez answered, and his words were thin. We were preparing a transfer window. There is damage in Tank 7's ceiling. We would like authorization to move the subject to isolation. You will secure the site. Containment remains in place. No transfer until we report to command. It was the kind of flat decision that lives in the gray space between procedure and emergency. For Hayes, it was tidy. For the men and women in the room, it was a pause filled with potential danger. The decision meant the subject stayed where it was. It meant we were about to spend hours with something that had already failed its enclosure. We took our positions at doors, at observation points, at the perimeter of the glass. Our radios emitted low static like a distant storm. Miguel's fingers traced the edge of an environmental monitor as if to anchor himself. The monitor blinked yellow again, a brief flare. I remember that specific yellow, the way it washed the control room in a light that made everything look like a warning sign someone had left on. Dr. Moreno asked for a list of observers. Dr. Cortez logged the request. They spoke in shorthand, meant to soothe or to make the problem seem smaller, but the subject in Tank 7 pressed its palm against the glass in a way that made the sound of a small seal. It was not a bang, not a crash, just a soft contact that registered because the world there was acoustically sterile. When this hand made contact, a ripple passed through me like cold and like the echo of an instrument played wrong. The subject's fingers curled, and for an instant I thought I saw motion that suggested intelligence, an examination of the glass, an attempt to sense what lay beyond its confinement. It didn't look like the reflex maneuvers of an animal in a trap. It had the studying posture of a thing trying to make meaning from new input. I have stood in front of animals at zoos. I have watched their faces move, their pupils track, their heads turn. This was not that. It was not the hunger of a caged beast. It was a cautious attention. I will not pretend I knew what that attention meant. We were not allowed to make proclamations. The official language, unknown origin, subject, containment, was the only safe vocabulary. But a human mind does not always speak in official language when it encounters a face that seems to look back. My mouth went dry. For a moment I had the urge to touch the glass from the outside, to see if that contact would move the thing inside. That is perhaps the first time that day I felt the moral weight of proximity, not as doctrine, but as an immediate, visceral reaction. If you stand close enough to a living thing that may possess intelligence, the world asks you who you are to keep it there. Someone in the control room made a note. The camera feed zoomed slightly, and the subject's hand slid back fractionally. The internal lighting shifted, and in that artificial dusk, something about the face became clearer. The mouth was small and without the set of a human mouth. There were subtle striations along the throat. The subject inhaled slowly, like a person waking. The condensation on the inside of the tank cleared in a stripe as if a small breath had been exhaled. "Is that movement expected?" Javier asked quietly. "It happens," Dr. Moreno said, and the word was a shield. "It's part of the subject's diurnal rhythm under observation. We expect minimal motor response. We're within acceptable parameters." Acceptable. That is an arithmetic taught in labs and in war rooms alike, where risk is turned into acceptable figures.
The problem is that ethics rarely makes itself neat enough to fit inside acceptable. You can label the decisions you make acceptable until the labels peel and the consequences leak. The monitor feed flicked to a different camera, a view down a corridor that led away from the tanks. There were cell doors similar to those we'd seen above, but these were larger, with thicker locks and additional harness points. One door in that row bore fresh scarring, metal torn at the edge with the kind of jaggedness that implies force. The camera stuttered and then returned to the tanks, focusing on the subject in Tank 7 again. The hand touched the glass and lingered. At some point, Colonel Hayes's voice came into the room again. He told us all to maintain our positions. He reminded us that we were not to speak to press or to civilians. He used the word containment as if it were a talisman. He told us we would be briefed again once command-level decisions had been made. He thanked us for our professionalism. It sounded perfunctory then, but later I would replay the cadence and find it full of a curt inevitability, like the closing of a gate. We set up a perimeter plan that evening, simple mechanical things. Someone logged personnel movement, someone else checked seals and locks, a technician ran a scrub of monitors. We kept our radios on but quiet. We ate in shifts and tried not to look at the tanks when we moved through the corridor.
Sleep came in snatches, if it came at all. The light inside the tanks had a way of taxing your eyes until rambling thoughts wandered into your head. David slept in a chair and woke with a start every time a valve hissed. Javier stared into the glass once for so long I thought he might fall into a trance. On the second morning, we found a notices board with a single piece of paper pinned by a bent staple. It listed maintenance windows and a curt warning, "Do not affect internal pressure." The line looked typed and final, the sort of bureaucratic fingernail at a fastened problem. Beneath it, someone, unknown, human, had scrawled in pen, "Tank 7, unstable." The scrawl was small and hurried, as if written by someone more afraid of being found than the note's content. That afternoon, a small team arrived with a mobile containment unit. It was a vehicle that looked like it had been designed for heavy lifting and careful transport. Men in hazmat suits moved with practiced efficiency, mechanical and sure. They carried rigging and clamps, and their movements made the room feel like a stage of choreography. Every hand had a place, every tool had its motion sequence. We watched as they set up a stabilizing frame around Tank 7. Dr. Cortez moved among them, giving instructions through clenched teeth. I don't know when the mood of controlled procedure turned into countdown. There is a point in every operation where the performance of competence starts to smell like the urgency of improvisation.
The rigging man assigned to check the tank's seal found a hairline fracture on the rim. It was a fissure no longer than my thumbnail, and yet it was enough to make the engineers blanch. Whoever said small things can mean a lot knew this kind of work. Dr. Cortez ordered a localized depressurization, a test to see if the current would stabilize the seal. He instructed technicians to prepare for a transfer should the seal fail. His voice was steady, but his hands moved jerkily. He had the look of a man who was calculating risks in more than one ledger. Dr. Moreno stood aside and watched like someone watching a patient on a ventilator. We were told to hold perimeter posts. I stood near a bank of monitors, my back to the tanks, but my attention pulled toward that one fissured rim. The mobile unit's sirens were off, the men moving with neutral faces and quiet voices. A technician in blue gloves applied a clamp and turned a valve. The pressure gauge nosed up, a little arrow crawling into a red zone on the dial. Someone murmured, and the atmosphere flexed like a rubber band. Then the monitor flashed. A big yellow warning lit up, louder than any of the technical chatter. The control room camera system caught a micro-surge of fluid as the fissure widened by a hair more than it had been 2 seconds before. The subject inside Tank 7 jerked as if something in its internal environment had changed dramatically. The hand rose and pounded, not hard in the way a human hits, but with a rhythmic insistence that sounded almost like communication. Dr. Cortez barked orders. The team moved faster. The mobile unit's clamps engaged with a metallic shriek, but the fissure gave way. The seal ruptured with a soft but catastrophic sound of glass and liquid. There was a pressure vent, a hiss, and the room filled with a fog so thin and chemical-smelling that my eyes stung. The tank's internal lights flickered and died, and in that dimming, the outline of the subject shifted and then moved. I only had the 2 seconds that felt like an hour. The subject's hand found the glass, and then, improbably, the tank door began to yield. It was not a blitz through steel. It was a slow, insistent push that levered at a poorly seized seam. The mobile containment men slammed into action. Fuel and motion and shouts filled the corridor. Alarms that had been soft suddenly turned to a wail. Javier yelled for a lockdown. Miguel cursed on the radio, saying things that were not in any manual. David grabbed a rifle and held it like it would root him to the floor. The world contracted to the size of that tank and the forms moving through the fog and the way the light drained from the faces and left them gaunt. Somewhere in that compressed time, I remember seeing the tallness of the subject as it came upright, the way the limbs extended in a motion that was both graceful and desperate.
It pushed the door open, not like a brute, but like someone using tools you didn't know a body should have. For a heartbeat, the subject's face came into clearer view, and its eyes, huge and dark, brushed my line of sight. The recognition I had felt earlier returned like an echo, this time not a glance, but a direct look across panes of glass and an atmosphere thick with whatever they'd used in that tank. I will confess now, and I will keep confessing, because memory is the one place I can own, that seeing that face looking at me felt like being named. It was not a word, it was not a voice, it was a look that compressed long private things into a second, curiosity, alarm, and an intention that wasn't human yet understood the contours of attention. The alarms rose, men moved, the control room lit up like a panic. Someone shouted for gas masks. A strobe of red came alive in the corridor, painting everyone the color of warning. We did what we were trained to do, and what men in rooms saved for worry do. We formed a line of bodies between the glass and the breach. We tried to buy time. We tried to make the shape of normal orders stand against the shape of a contingency that belonged in nightmares. When the tank door finally gave entirely, the subject stepped into air that did not smell like the inside of a tank. It made a little sound, low and terrible in its smallness. The subject's head tilted as if testing the world. It stood as tall as I am wide, and moved in a way that suggested deliberation. It did not lunge, it did not scream, it moved with a terrible intention that is harder to define than any act of fury. It was a careful exploration with limbs built for different purposes. That movement is where the part that will go on in my life forever began to accelerate. The room's order unraveled in chirps of alarm, and Dr. Cortez's face went white. People who were never meant to hold living things found themselves reacting to presence. We lunged, we shouted, we tried protocol. Some of the men with mobile unit tools worked to recapture the subject. Others were pushed back by the fog and the pressure of whatever chemical the tank had used to stabilize the interior. A bullet grazed a tank bank in the confusion and made a razor noise on stainless. The sound of impact sent a spray that glittered in the air like 100 tiny stars. The subject turned when it heard the shot and seemed to become larger in its attentiveness. There was something in its posture then that suggested recognition again, but of what I could not say. Recognition of us, maybe, recognition of the sound, recognition of its own being meeting limits. We had minutes, maybe less. We were in the middle of an emergency that was not imagined in the paperwork we had been given. The alarms were a chorus. Connections that held the life support systems back to their circuits responded in half measures. And somewhere in the back of my head, the voice of the colonel, containment remains in place, played like an instrument out of tune. The last thing I remember before everything sped into a whirl of commands and shouts was the look of that subject when it turned its face toward me again and pointed. Not a random motion, the limb extended with a straightness that felt like a gesture. Its finger, too long, articulate, stretched in the direction of the door I was standing near. It pointed at me in a way that felt accusatory and curious at once, like someone saying, "There you are." And then the alarm picked up an escalated tone, and the room became a place of noise and motion. We moved to contain. Men in suits wrenched at clamps. The fog grew thick. The radio feed filled with a signal I could barely parse. I started to run. We did not know then that what we had done to keep ourselves safe would also be the beginning of decisions much heavier than our training. We did not know we would be asked to step back and watch as command decided what to do with what had been freed. We were in motion, and for a while motion is enough. I remember the taste of metal in the air, the sting under my eyes, and the sight of the tall subject moving through the fog with an efficiency that made human motion look clumsy. I remember thinking in the split second before everything changed that the desert outside of the facility was too big and too quiet to hold what was happening beneath it. I remembered, too, that the desert had a way of swallowing things. I thought about the shape of the sky and about the smallness of my own capacity to answer what we had found. We were told to secure the asset. We tried. The next movements were ordered and yet raw, a mixture of protocol and panic. The subject moved toward a door we'd just come through. It crossed thresholds like someone who had been taught where to step. Then, as men tried to close ranks, it raised its hand and pointed at me once more. I cannot put into words what meaning lay behind that gesture. I only know that for a moment it did not seem like a wild animal's reflex. It seemed like a thing with a question. We are trained to respond to questions with orders. We are not trained to answer the kind of question that looks like a finger pointing in a hole and sounds like a life. It pointed at me again, an index finger longer than it should have been, pale against the fog, deliberate as a command. For a second the hallway shrank to the distance between its hand and mine. I remember thinking that if the thing could name me without a word, then whatever we were about to do would be answered by a being who had understood us in some way we had not understood it. The containment team slammed into motion. Men with padded suits and mechanical arms tried to shepherd the subject back toward the tank bay. Some of them moved with a practiced agility that said they'd done this before. Others moved like men fraying at the edges of a map they could no longer read. Someone shouted, "Gas masks, now!" Someone else hit a manual lock, and the corridor's bulkhead began to grind closed. For a moment it felt like the architecture itself was keeping time with us. We formed a line, not a heroic charge, but a human wall built from training and fear. Javier's eyes were wide, the way they get when he measures danger like a man checking a fuse. Miguel's radio sputtered in his hand. David had a flashlight angled low, sweeping shadows. I remember how ordinary our motions were, the world reduced to gestures we had used 1,000 times. Secure that door, check that panel, report status. It was as if the smallest familiar acts could stitch the situation back into something manageable. Then alarms escalated again, a different tone, higher and more urgent. A camera feed caught movement down a side corridor, another tank door, a latch, a shadow. The subject from Tank 7 was not alone. The monitors showed a blur of pale shapes moving through the fog, limbs extending in ways that made men step back and then lunge forward. The breach was not a single animal bolting out. The breach was a ripple, a failure that had propagated from one weakness into several. You learn a new kind of equation in moments like that. How many exits, how many breaches, how many lives stand between you and a catastrophe. We had no power to change the factors writ on those screens. We had to choose the next move and do it with whatever was close to us. Colonel Hayes's voice came over the net, short, clipped, the voice of someone carrying a ledger of other people's lives. Evacuate non-essential personnel, seal the primary corridor, prepare for containment reinforcement. Containment reinforcement meant people with heavier hardware and suppressing protocols. Men who arrived in armored carriers moved down the shafts like a slow animal, lights bouncing off steel. They were efficient and grim. They pushed hard down the central corridor and into the tank area, trying to entrap the escaping subjects between walls and lines. Visuals from the control room feed flashed. A door that had been sealed kicked in from the outside. Something with long fingers scaled a wall and used mechanical points on the door to lever it open. The camera angle skimmed over an emergency lock that had been bent outward in a way that suggested not brute force, but cunning use of environment. I won't pretend the next hours were coherent in memory. They resolve as flashes, the muffled thud of suppressed weapons, the metallic smell that blended with the chemical fog and left my mouth tasting flat and metallic, the way lights strobed red, then white and back again, the screaming static of a radio that only ever carries grief. We ran corridors that, minutes before, had been places where men went to drink water and file reports. Now they were improvised battlefields. Some of the specimens moved with surprising economy. One of them, long in the legs, almost gangly by our standards, slid down a service chute and dropped into a maintenance way 3 decks below like a shadow finding its seam. Another used a broken conduit to cross a service bridge, fingers testing bolts the way a climber reads grains of handhold. They did not move with animal abandon, they moved with purpose. That choice of motion is what kept cutting a thread through me. This was not merely escape, it was, at times, navigation. We lost people. I won't give numbers, I will not turn faces into statistics, but there were men who did not go home that night, and there were men who carried new holes into their lives, small private places where something left and never returned. The wounds were not the point I returned to first. The first thing that presses on the mind is the way the tall subject turned and, mid-escape, looked back at me like a person who had been interrupted. The recognition seemed to pass between us again, an exchange that had neither word nor gesture beyond that shared focus. We chased, we cordoned, we made choices that reacted more than planned. The breach grew. The facility's automated lockdown fought back, the blast doors descended and hydraulic locks engaged, but the pressure wave from the ruptured tanks and the panic of men moving in half-light undermined those protections. As the containment situation unraveled, 2 clear problems rose above the rest: the unknown biological threat and the exposure of whatever lay beneath the desert. Command-level minds began to prioritize them differently than men in the corridors. To the people here, the immediate danger was getting clear of the specimens and getting clear of the place. To the men at higher levels, the danger included the possibility that news, evidence would leak. The radio crackled with orders from above that felt like negotiation under a time bomb. There were requests for reinforcements, calls for chemical suppressors, pleas to bring further containment teams. There were also terse messages suggesting a different posture: make this a sealed event, classify the incident, prevent external access. Those 2 tracks, reconciling safety and secrecy, ran like twin currents through every decision. You could feel the way the language shifted depending on the speaker. Some talked in triage, some talked in jurisdiction. I was near a stairwell when a blast of wind and dust came through, carrying with it the smell of gritty concrete and something like the tang of burned plastic. The hallway filled with dust and a confusion of shouts. Someone pulled me by the sleeve and said, "Get out, now!" We moved, and as we did, I saw Dr. Moreno moving in the opposite direction, toward the failing tank area, toward where the subjects had been kept. He did not go with the herd of evacuation. He moved as if drawn by duty and a private obligation. I wanted to call out to him, to protest, to force him to follow procedure. But the place had a way of swallowing voices. In the stairwell, men fell into groups. We counted heads the way you count words in a contract. We had lost radio range in places. The comms were jittery. Miguel kept shouting into his handset, trying to patch a net that kept skipping. Colonel Hayes appeared at the top of the stairs like a man forced out of an office. He had a pair of binoculars in hand and a face that had gone away from the color of the desert into something chiseled by lack of sleep. He barked orders with the kind of focus that didn't leave room for argument. Get personnel out, lock the perimeters. If you can save equipment, take photos. If you can't, leave it. That last line, if you can't, leave it, hung with an arithmetic of loss that made me think about who counts as equipment and who counts as human. We moved toward exits, toward the light. Outside, the sky was the same indifferent desert blue. It should have been a comfort. Instead, it appeared like a challenge. This ordinary sky held a hole that led to things we had not been invited to see. Men ran to vehicles. Some tried to call families and were told later not to mention anything. Others were simply left with the shock of having held something in their hands that did not fit the vocabulary they'd been given. Back at command, the meeting was fast, full, and without the small courtesies men in the field receive in slower times. Generals and colonels and civilian oversight were on the net in a way that changed the rhythm of the words. There was a level of administrative violence in the way options were parsed: isolate and study versus evacuate and destroy. Dr. Cortez argued for preservation of the specimens, scientific value, chain of custody, the opportunity to learn. Dr. Moreno argued in papers of ethics, but he spoke softly, and the sound of his voice was like someone who knew that the move he advocated might not be the one the room would accept. "I understand the value," crowned a general, voice flat with the compression of decision, "but we cannot allow further exposure." He used that word, exposure, with the same care a clinician would use when discussing a contagion. "We will lose more trying to move every asset out. We will attract attention. The safest course is to evacuate and destroy the facility." "Destroy?" Dr. Cortez said. His face tightened into a half-formed protest. "That would erase potential." "It would erase evidence of failure," another officer said. "It would close the thread. If we don't, we risk leaks. We risk a public incident. We risk political cost." The meeting became less a deliberation about a site and more an arithmetic about risk to a nation, to reputations, to careers. Generals argued about samples. Generals argued about precedents. The argument that eventually carried the day was not the one of morality as we might measure it, but the one of control, containing the narrative as well as the specimens. I sat in the staging room and listened through the net. I felt the thread of the argument slip past me like a current under a dock. The decision came: evacuate all non-essential personnel, pull the site down, demolish and bury. It was a phrase that landed like a gavel. The demolition meters in the room hummed quietly like machines deciding a fate. The word demolish triggered a chain of practical actions. Men who had been counting heads were now given charges, not as an explosive manual, but as a set of permissible chores in a controlled plan. We were told, not asked, to clear the remaining people and move to a safe distance. We were given positions that were both necessary and morally complicated. The explosives crews moved with a teamwork that was cold and expert. They secured detonators, set line charges in blast patterns designed to collapse central support and send debris down into a self-contained cavity. The idea was to crush the levels into one another until access was impossible, then mask the site as a structural failure caused by the seismic stresses that the colonel could mention in later briefings. Dr. Moreno came to me as we were about to move to our positions. His face was drawn. He touched my forearm in a way that felt like a petition rather than an instruction. "You saw them," he said. "You were there." "I saw enough," I answered. "We all did." He kept his voice low. "If you see anything after, if you remember anything you think people should know." He couldn't finish the sentence. He did not need to. The thing he couldn't say was the part where your memory becomes evidence, and evidence becomes dangerous. We went to our posts. The desert around the site was cleared of all but essential personnel. The sky was a sharp mechanical blue. There was a technical calm to the way the crews operated, measuring angles, checking charge yields, setting charge sequences. A man in protective goggles briefed us on timings without going into the details that might allow a layman to reconstruct them later. I watched the crews and saw how men can turn the most morally fraught jobs into boxes of competence they can close around themselves, rituals of focus that keep regret at a distance.
From our vantage point, we watched the facility's tall access hatches and observation bays, the same panes that had held the tanks, become small screws of light in the darkening hole. The charges went in where concrete was loaded and joints were known to fail. The men who placed them were not callous. They were men made of the same bones as the rest of us, only given a task that asked them to resolve dilemmas with a tool. Some of them looked at the horizon while they worked. I think they hoped the sky would give them absolution in its vastness.
There was a small ritual before detonation. Men checked each other for hearing protection. Colonels took final reads on the perimeter. Dr. Cortez had a hand pressed to his forehead, eyes shut. Dr. Moreno was watching the doorway to level 5 like a man marking the last time he'd see a patient. The colonel gave a nod. He had the expression of someone who has ordered removals before and knows the cost. The detonator lit, not with the fireworks of a blockbuster movie, but with a terse, compressed sequence, a counted cadence, a burst of noise, the ground trembling in a subtle beginning. The controlled sequence began at a few calculated points. Panels bent, concrete tore in a way that did not feel theatrical, but deeply real, the kind of violence you find in nature rather than in artifice. Dust rose in the air in a slow wave, curling blossoms like the breath of an animal. The detonation wasn't a single scream, it was a controlled collapse, a series of precise failures, and then the top came off the site like a lid. We stood and watched as columns of concrete and steel collapsed inward, folding into themselves. The tank bay was compressed, and the place where the tanks had stood became a bowl of dust and steam. A cloud of choking powder climbed out of the core and swallowed the lights. We watched as a new hole formed where there had been architecture. It was not the cinematic flash that wipes history clean, it was the grinding of closure. When the dust finally settled, hours later in terms of feeling, minutes in reality, the site was a crater, a wound in the earth encircled by temporary fencing and men with clipboards. Thick mobile units moved in to lay down tarps and to monitor for leaks of the chemicals used in containment systems. There were cameras rolling, but those recordings would be cataloged in folders that would never see the light of day. We drove away in a convoy that smelled of diesel and the tang of suppressed adrenaline. Men sat quietly, some with heads in their hands. Miguel stared out the window for so long I thought his eyes might dry up. David drove and said little. Javier, who had always been practical, held our handsets like a talisman. I was tired in a way that wasn't just physical. There was a heavy reconfiguration in how I related to the world. The desert slid by like the same place we had left, but under my skin something had shifted. The official story that came later was tidy in ways that the night was not. It spoke of unexpected structural failure in an underground research facility, a chemical release, and a controlled demolition to prevent environmental hazard. There were press releases about safety protocols and accountability measures. People who had been there received memorandums that asked them to sign confidentiality agreements. They were told to preserve the integrity of national operations.
Some men signed quickly, their signatures harsh and black on the page. Others took longer, fingers hovering as if over a trapdoor. I remember the clerk who handed me the documents. Her eyes looked away when I asked a question she couldn't answer. Then she smiled, like someone making a small, polite lie about an unpleasant task. We were debriefed again and again into a language that turned living complexity into forms, times, locations, module IDs. The forms were efficient at scrubbing out feelings. They were not, however, efficient at scrubbing the memory of faces. The way the tall subject turned and pointed stayed with me. It didn't fit into any of the categories the forms offered. My answers were recorded. I answered them honestly, to the extent that my honesty was what they were asking for.
objective, descriptive, mediated. But I kept parts for myself, the pitch of its voice in that low sound, the way it pressed at the glass, the recognition. After the initial formalities, the men who had been on the ground pulled apart. Some were reassigned, others were discharged quietly with pensions and sealed records. Our unit was broken up. Orders rerouted us into jobs where we would be less likely to cross paths. Miguel moved to communications support elsewhere. Javier took an assignment overseas. David drove supply convoys for a while and then left the service. I was honorably discharged a few months later. They gave me paperwork that was neat and sterile, a packet that bureaucratized a transformation in my life. The nights after were when the weight came down the hardest. Memory does not arrive all at once. It rivers in, feeds off itself. I woke sometimes with the feel of a fingertip on glass. I would find myself staring at the kitchen window in the middle of the night and expecting, absurdly, for something to look back. My wife, asked me once to tell her what happened. I tried, and the narrative that came out of my mouth was a skeletal version framed in sanitized terms. She listened, and then asked the kind of simple question that cuts deeper than any interrogation. Do you ever think about what was in those tanks? I wanted to be able to answer. I swallowed and said, yes. That was both the truth and not the whole truth. I thought of the small hand, the eyes, the way the subject had seemed to judge me with a look that made me feel seen and found wanting. I thought of Dr. Moreno watching with a scientist's agony, and of Dr. Cortez arguing for preservation as if data could be a substitute for conscience. The agreement I signed forbade me from speaking publicly. It also forbade me from keeping certain files, from disclosing technical details, from discussing locations. The legal language had a thoroughness that suggested not just the sealing of a facility, but the sealing of speech. Men I had worked with took different paths. Some obeyed in the way men obey, quietly, with their souls sealed like letters in envelopes.
Others rebelled in small ways, an offhand remark over beers, a midnight smoke, a story told to someone who would later forget the exact details. The fear of exposure was a real thing, not just the fear that the public might know, but the fear that whatever had happened would become a currency in the wrong hands. I tried to resume a life. I took a job that had nothing to do with the military. I tried to find the small pleasures of ordinary days. But memory is not merely a record. It's a presence that can become a companion. Sometimes at the grocery store, I would see a child with a forehead too big for a face and find myself blinking hard, feeling a tug of recollection, and then a shame that my brain would make such leaps. I chastised myself for being human, but that didn't keep the images from spilling into my waking mind. People ask now why we didn't do more. Why didn't we take the tanks and bury them somewhere the public would see? Because secrecy isn't only a moral posture, it's also a network of systems and histories. The men in the meeting rooms had reasons that fit their world: national security, the avoidance of panic, bureaucratic precedent. Those reasons are persuasive for some and torturous for others. I will not use my voice to indict the men who, from their point of view, made the rational choice. I will only say this: when men decide in rooms far from the field, their decisions carry the weight of all kinds of consequences, moral as well as strategic. Dr. Moreno tried to keep his conscience alive in small ways. I saw him once, months later, alone at a gas station in a town halfway between bases. He looked older, as if the corridor had taken years from him. We sat outside in a car. He said, "You remember their eyes?" I nodded. He said, I keep thinking of the way one of them looked like it wanted to ask something. His hands trembled slightly. Do we have the right to hold something like that? He didn't answer his own question. I didn't either. There was no clean way to answer. I never found out if any specimens survived under the rubble. There were rumors later, whispers of a transfer to another site before the charge, of something recovered from the edge of the crater. I heard them the way any man hears rumor, with a mixture of curiosity, repulsion, and a desire to deny. I cannot confirm any of them. I will not be the man who invents certainty to fill the gaps in my memory. The truth that matters to me is what I saw and felt. There was life in those tanks. It was intelligent enough to fix its attention on us. It understood, if not our words, then at least our shape. And we chose, in the end, to erase the architecture that had held them. Sometimes I think about the ethics of it in a concrete way. If tomorrow someone could say, with absolute proof, that the specimens were not human and dangerous on a planetary scale, I think I could reconcile the demolition in my mind as a necessary, tragic defense.
But if tomorrow someone produced evidence showing we had willfully destroyed intelligences that could have been reasoned with, then what we did would not be defensible. The problem is that reality rarely gives you such tidy options. It leaves you with ambiguity and with the responsibility to carry it. There are other consequences, softer but just as corrosive. I have a hard time with silence now. When someone in a meeting suggests hiding an error or softening a truth, a part of me winces. The habit of secrecy does not die easily. It creates old grooves in conversation and makes men prefer the closure of concealment to the awkwardness of accountability. That worry keeps me awake. It also makes me careful about who I trust. There is a private memory that returns more than the rest. The midday after the demolition, while the crew was still inventorying the perimeter, I walked to the edge of the staging area and looked out toward the flat desert. The sky was unassuming. The air held the heat that makes distant things shimmer. I thought about the subject pointing at me and wondered what that gesture had meant in its world. Had it been accusation? Inquiry? A simple noting? I do not know. But I know this. When you see something that is not human look at you with intent, you are changed in ways that no document can fully account for. 2 years after Dulce, I had a son. The birth was a small, hopeful thing that did not cancel the past. When I hold him, when he grips my finger with the raw, demanding certainty of a newborn, I sometimes think of the thin fingers of the subject in the tank. The juxtaposition is a daily moral litmus. A human child, and somewhere in memory, a creature that pressed a palm against glass, as if asking what lay beyond. The presence of that memory makes me both tender and terrified. It is, in some perverse way, a call to vigilance that is not military, a call to keep our humanity in the face of decisions that ask us to reduce other beings to data. I have told parts of this story to a handful of people I trusted, men who had been there, some who were not. The reactions are always a mirror of each person's faith in institutions. Some feel vindicated by the notion that we protected the public. Others are furious, convinced we made a moral mistake. I am neither wholly condemnatory nor wholly comforting. I live in the tension. My chest tightens when I think of the ways our systems prioritize certain truths and bury others. Every now and then, when I drive out past where the road begins to thin and the desert returns to its old, patient business, I find myself stopping and letting the engine idle. The world there seems the same. Scrub brush, distant ridge lines, coyotes if you are lucky enough to listen at dusk. But I have the sense sometimes that the earth remembers. Dirt retains shapes. It stores the impression of pressure.
If anything did survive the demolition, if a slender hand somehow found a seam and withdrew into an undercut of the crater, there is a small, terrible hope and a smaller, harder fear that keeps me awake. The hope is childish and sentimental. Perhaps the beings escaped and live under the sand, learning our patterns. The fear is more practical. Perhaps something we could not anticipate remained intact and will be discovered at some point when the world is less patient with secrets. I cannot answer whether secrets are always worse buried. Burying hides accident from public eyes. It hides sins and mistakes and necessary evils. Sometimes burying is the right action if the alternative is catastrophe. But burying also conceals the moral ledger of what we did to survive a night. It denies the public's right to decide whether transparency or secrecy is worth its cost. I am haunted not just by the tall eyes behind glass, but by the fact that so many of our decisions are made behind closed doors, with a vocabulary created to sanitize choices. If you accept this as an account, that is, a human memory of a night in 1987 when we found something underground worth more than our immediate understanding, then accept too that the ending is not neat. We demolished an underground holding site in New Mexico. We watched concrete fold in on itself and patted the dust down with the authority of men obeying orders. We dispersed papers, signed NDAs, and moved on with our lives. Some of us still carry guilt. Some of us still ask if we had the right to do what we did. I still carry the image of a hand pressed to glass and the sense that it was asking something of me that I could not answer. I tell this not to ignite a conspiracy, but to invite caution. When institutions choose secrecy over conversation, when decisions about other beings are made in rooms of people who may never meet those beings, the moral consequences are vast. We have to ask ourselves what we would do if we knew, without a doubt, that intelligence existed beyond us. Would we act out of fear? Out of curiosity? Out of compassion? I do not have the answer, but I have the memory, and memories are stubborn instructors. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is asleep and the desert's hush finds a way into my dreams, I think of the tall subject one last time. I imagine that it was not only frightened or angry. I imagine that it had been studied, catalogued, and reduced to terms because we lacked the language to speak to it as an equal. I imagine, foolishly perhaps, that anything that looked at me with that intent had an inner life that I ruined with my silence and my signature. That image chases me like dust on long roads. I tell this story because of that dust, because the desert keeps things and sometimes returns them, because the act of burying, even when sanctioned, feels like a thing that demands a reckoning in the quiet years that follow.
Because men and women who have been asked to do unpleasant work deserve to be heard when memory presses through their lies and legal forms and reaches for public understanding. Not for fame, not for spectacle, but because the moral weight of choices like ours does not evaporate just because it was made in a room with curtains. If this account has held your attention and you want to hear more collected testimonies about the strange and the classified, there's another story on your screen now that explores a different encounter rooted in the same era. Watch the next account, and, if you find it meaningful, consider what secrecy asks of us and what transparency might cost.